So, QPQ International, as most of you know, is an investment advisory firm, and we focus on supporting project developers and investors in the renewable energy sector from the funding perspective. So, we help developers to secure funding, whether it's project finance, equity, debt, development capital. We help developers to sell their projects. And of course, we also help investors to originate good projects. We pride ourselves for a large network that we have built over the years. We work with various type of investors, amongst them private equity, infrastructure, pension, sovereign funds, family offices, a lot of strategic investors. We work with many IPPs, independent power producers. We work with EPC plus F. We work with development banks, export finance institutions, and large funds like BlackRock, I Squared Capital, and many others. So we have also large network of project developers. Our focus is purely on the renewable energy and sustainability sector. So if you guys have access to projects, if you develop projects, or you have someone in your network who who have a project that needs funding, or a project that might be available for sale, you can always reach out to us. As we kind of go through today's presentation, webinar, I will be also uploading some files, and in the chat section where you can learn about the presentation, but also learn about how you can submit projects to us directly to my email or through Funding Accelerator that we have on our website. There are various options. I'll be also, of course, attaching Seth's presentation and our short QPQ presentation for your reference. Additionally, over the next couple of months, we will be attending a number of conferences. And for those who happen to be in those conferences, we would be happy to meet in person. Next week, I am in San Diego at Intersolar in the US. Following week, we will be having a booth at the Key Energy Transition Expo in Rimini in Italy. So myself and Oksana will be there. And then in May, we will be at Intersolar in Munich. So there are a number of events that are coming up. So we would be happy to meet with project developers, with potential referral partners, with investors. We live in a digital world. A lot of meetings happen, online, but it's always nice to have some personal touch and meet people in person. For those who might have questions, and I'm sure there will be some because the topic of today's webinar is very interesting, please use a Q&A feature, not the chat, but Q&A section where you can post questions, and then as Seth will wrap up with the presentation part, we'll dedicate some 10-15 minutes hopefully for the Q&A session. So I'll just do a quick basically overview of today's topic. I'm sure that Seth will be better introducing himself and the topic, but I'll just in short words, we're going to talk about reframing the scale of renewable electricity development, and today we will be exploring key factors reshaping the electricity investment and development landscape while the market is facing development delays despite unprecedented demand and growth. And few words about Seth. Well, first of all, thank you very much for making yourself available. So, at such an early hour. Seth is based in New Zealand. It's just after 5 a.m. Seth is as project manager at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council in New Zealand. So has a lot of very important projects, and amongst them he's overseeing sustainability ratings for New Zealand transport agencies and roads of national significance, Water Care's Central Interceptor project, and the City Rail Link project. I'll let you, Seth, to take over from here and do a proper introduction and the agenda for today's webinar. And once again, thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with our audience.
Great, thank you. I'll share my screen. Simple request.
That should work. I'll switch off my audio and video. I'll be managing the questions in the end. But if you need anything, I can hear, I can see you. So you just ask me and I'll pop back on stage. Yeah.
Okay, great. You should be able to see that now.
Yep, I can see a screen. Perfect.
Great. All right. My name is Seth Scott. I am the project manager for the Infrastructure Sustainability Council here in Auckland, New Zealand. And today we're going to be talking about reframing the scale of renewable electricity development. And when I talk about scale, I'm really talking about demand. So here's the key topics we're going to cover today. So there's a rapid increase happening right now in demand, and it's due to several different factors. Decarbonization is a big one, AI, and climate change as a general driver. So we're going to talk about those issues. We're going to talk about a quick history lesson. I'm sure a lot of you will know those history lessons, but I'm going to try to make a small point out of it. Coal being a battery as opposed to just an energy source, closing the intermittency gap. We're going to talk about developing nations and how population growth is affecting them. And we're going to talk about what the US exit means for energy a little bit right at the end.
Seth, sorry for interrupting you here. There is a little bit of, the sound, something wrong with the sound. So if you have your microphone somewhere, nearby, maybe you can move it a bit closer because it sounds like a bit muffled.
Okay.
Or maybe you just can move closer to the if you're using laptop's microphone, inbuilt microphone, just move closer to the. Yeah, I think it would be easier rather than.
How's that? Is
Oh
that
yeah,
better?
yeah, much better. Yes, definitely.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, that's good.
Perfect.
Great. So let's set the scene here. I think what we're seeing right now is just an unprecedented demand for electrification. Uh, we're we're experiencing it from multiple different quarters, but more importantly, we've experienced an increase in demand in just the last 2 years that we're not necessarily prepared for because of the length of time frames required for developing our solar, wind, and other renewable energies. Developers are waiting on permitting and FID. Investors are sitting on dry powder waiting for price signals and government action. And governments are lagging behind on climate action and investors. Sorry. Governments are lagging behind on climate action and investor assurance, largely because it's been politicized and governments no longer have the balanced budgets needed for large infrastructure projects. So we're seeing supply chain bottlenecks. For example, even if you order your undersea cable today, it'll be 10 years before it shows up on your offshore wind farm. And when those pipelines of work are constricted, it means we're losing our experienced workers, our momentum, and it makes it that much harder to proceed. So yeah, it's a tough industry, but this industry also has opportunities for forward-thinking players. And here's why. Oops. You're probably familiar with this scale. This is showing the global greenhouse gas emissions of the world. You're used to thinking of it as just energy being an issue that you have to deal with renewable energy. But in fact, all of these areas, agriculture, forestry, and land use, waste, industry, chemicals, cement, all of those are decarbonizing and all of them also need that energy. So renewable energy can have a factor in all of this chart. And that means that we have an immense amount of demand, not just coming from the energy sector, not just traditional areas we think of like road transport and shipping, but from all across all industries. So looking at why that's happening, I think something happened back in 2020. When we had the pandemic, it kind of sparked this recognition of a worldwide crisis. Suddenly people could conceptualize something that happens globally being a problem. And people were suddenly interested in climate change and renewable energy. I saw this huge uptick in people suddenly talking about climate change, talking about decarbonization. And that released this floodgate of demand in places we don't traditionally look. It's not about powering homes and lights anymore. Now, at least 64% of what you see on this chart can be decarbonized using electrification. So everybody's been looking at electric vehicles, but what about the heavy vehicles we use? I was at a conference in October, and Holcim, the cement company, drove in a fully electric cement truck. We're seeing cat-built electric bulldozers. We're seeing cranes, dump trucks, even huge mining vehicles, all going electric. And it makes sense because these can charge up on the job site. We're seeing an increased use of industrial heat pumps. Everybody has a heat pump in their home now, but industrial heat pumps are becoming popular. I talked to a greenhouse grower who was installing a heat pump instead of a gas boiler because gas is being cut off here in New Zealand in the next 5 years. I've spoken to Genesis Energy here in New Zealand, and it's just not profitable for them anymore to be creating new gas pipelines and shipping gas around the country. So they're going to stop using gas altogether, which means in the next 5 years, even though New Zealand is small, it's a country that's going to have to completely decarbonize and move to electrification for all of its gas products. It's also something we saw since the Ukraine war, that many Eastern European and European nations have been cut off from or are no longer interested in using gas, and so they're all going to move towards electrification. If you look over here in the industry section, you'll see steel, cement, those areas. Well, here in New Zealand, NZ Steel has purchased an arc furnace. It's going to need 30 megawatts of power when it comes online in 2026, and all of that is going to be renewable energy. They've already signed a power purchase agreement to make sure of that. As for the farming, agriculture, forestry, and land use, most of that relies on fossil fuels for their fertilizer. Well, the Haber-Bosch process is now being replaced by electrolysis to make ammonia. There's a company in Australia called Jupiter Ionics, which uses electrolysis to create ammonia right on the farm. And that's going to revolutionize the way ammonia is used around the world, and it's going to make sure that it's being made through electrolysis, which will require renewable energy directly on location. Electrolysis is also driving chemical production for replacing oil. It's driving ammonia, methanol, and hydrogen production for shipping fuels and aviation fuels. And one you might not have heard of is looking to replace agriculture altogether is something called cellular agriculture, which is growing food in stainless steel tanks. And it uses nothing but electricity, air, and sometimes yeast. It's already on the market. It's a mature technology. People are eating cultivated meat in Singapore. People are drinking coffee in Finland. You can make meat, algae, coffee, leather, cat food, pretty much anything you can grow on a farm, you can now make with cellular agriculture. And anything you make with cellular agriculture is now using renewable energy. So there's this tremendous demand you'd never know is coming from completely disparate sectors that are completely separate from what you think of as renewable energy. You'd be surprised to know, for example, that over half of the world's cooking is still done with wood. But with gas going away and wood becoming more scarce, millions of restaurants around the world are going to be moving to induction cooktops, and more homes are going to be moving to electric ranges. So we see a tremendous demand for renewable energy just in the restaurant sector. If you're starting a renewable energy project today, when it comes online in 5 or 10 years, your customers will look very different from what you imagined. That's where you need to base the economics of your deal, not on the demand you see in the market today, but where we're going to be in just 5 to 10 years. One of the other major drivers of this is AI. And I know you've heard so much about AI in the last few years. You're probably sick of hearing AI, and that's fine. But what we're experiencing, the reason you're hearing so much about it is because we're experiencing an AI spring. It's the last 10 years has just shown this explosion in growth. Spring meaning that we used to be in the winter of AI when no one was investing in it and the tech just wasn't getting much attention. Now it's getting so much attention you can't hear about it except for every single day. So yeah, you've heard about ChatGPT and DeepSeek and self-driving cars, and big data has never been this intelligent. And you know that it requires a lot of energy in order to drive that. We've got a $1.3 trillion market by 2032. That's tremendous growth. It's so much growth that the power demand in data centers in the US is expected to equal 11.7% of US power demand. Globally, it's up to 2 to 4% growth every single year. And while that's not distributed evenly around the world, some places obviously are more likely to have data centers and increase that power use. It's still 2 to 4% globally. That's a tremendous amount of growth. And all of that is going to be renewable energy because The data centers out there are interested in having renewable power. All the companies involved are not interested in perpetuating climate change. I want to talk about one more item about AI that you probably have not heard of, and this is called Moravec's paradox. Moravec's paradox says this essentially: the human brain has three parts to it. Two of them are most relevant to this discussion. One is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain that does our analytical thinking. It's the part we use for speech and for just generally solving problems. So it's the part we might use to play chess or type an email or talk to people. Well, those are things that AI does really well. And it turns out there are things that humans don't do very well. We need ChatGPT because, frankly, we're not that great at communicating or formulating emails. But the reason AI does it very well is because it can do those pathways, and it's fairly straightforward and simple. The reason humans can't do it very well is because that part of our brain only developed about 250,000 years ago. The part of our brain that's been around for a much, much longer time is our amygdala. It's been around for a million years or more, and it's been developing not just in the human species, but in species before it. So it's got, I guess you could say, a legacy of knowledge and learning in and perfecting this part of the brain to work. Well, AI doesn't have that experience. So AI has a very difficult time trying to do things that we take for granted. And the best example is driving a car. If you're driving a car down the road, think about all the things you're doing at the same time. You're trying to steer, you're pushing the brake and the gas pedal. Meanwhile, you're listening to music, you're talking to the other people in the car, you're thinking thoughts about something else. And you're also looking down the road and making predictions. So you'll see somebody standing on the sidewalk down the road, and you have to decide whether or not that person is going to walk in front of you and what you're going to do if that happens. You're making those decisions based on small clues like the look on that person's face, or maybe the clothes they're wearing, or how close they are to the sidewalk, or where the other cars are in the area around you. All of that's happening at once, and AI has an incredibly difficult time doing that. So what Moravec's paradox is saying is that the more we want AI to do, the more complicated it gets and the harder AI has in doing it. And that means it requires a great deal amount more power. Think of it a lot like Moore's law for transistors. The more time goes by, the smaller they get. Well, Moravec's paradox says the more the time goes by, the more power AI is going to need to accomplish the task that we want it to. So that's going to create an incredible amount of demand for renewable energy. So we see an avalanche of electricity demand coming. And meanwhile, the globe's population is increasing from 8 billion to 10 billion. So we talked about AI spring, we've talked about Moravec's paradox, but the population growth is another big one. We're seeing growth in countries like India and Nigeria. The African continent in particular is growing. India has committed to 50% of its total electricity from renewable sources by 2030, and that's up from only 23% today. Meanwhile, 9 of the top 10 nations for population growth are in Africa, countries with very little electrical infrastructure. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a while. But on top of that, we have the world going through climate change. Climate change is going to drive electrification more every year as we see more droughts, more extreme weather, more heat waves. We're going to see companies embracing that decarbonization challenge, and we're going to see people calling for more renewable energy. Decarbonization alone is probably one of the biggest factors, and we just covered that in that one slide. And then, of course, we have Jevons paradox. And I imagine most of you on this call have heard of Jevons paradox and know what it is. But I think that we underestimate the amount of demand that Jevons paradox creates. If you're not familiar with it, essentially it says that the more energy you create, the more humans will find ways to use that energy. The less expensive you make the energy, the more people will use it. So the takeaway here is that you're not building for existing demand. You're building for the demand that your construction creates. So every time you build a renewable energy project, whether it's a wind farm or a solar farm, you're creating demand for that product just by having it exist. And what do we have to meet all of this avalanche of demand that's coming our way in the next 5 to 10 years? Well, we have this and we have this. Does this look like it's going to be enough to you? I don't think it is. And it just doesn't seem like the tool set that we need compared with what we're up against. So before we tackle that, I want to go back and have a quick history lesson to see how we got here. And this is going to be focused mostly on the US, but I think it's a good indication because similar processes have gone through all of the countries in the world. Let's just take a look.
By the way, says that we can see the video is playing, but there is no sound. Is that how it's supposed to be or no?
Sorry, you don't have any sound?
No sound, no.
Oh, that's odd. Okay. That's very strange. All right. Well, I'll just describe it. So essentially, we've been building, we've had solar since 1884 and hydropower since 1881. And then that kicked off a flurry of production from 1920 through the 1940s of dam production. Hydropower accounted for 1/3 of the electricity generation in America. But by 1980, that was down to 12%. And that's because the Sierra Club in 1956 started to protest against hydropower dams. And by the 1960s and 70s, environmentalists made it impossible to build new hydroelectric dams in the US. So renewable energy through hydroelectric became de-emphasized in the US. And of course, this forced companies to move towards coal, oil, and natural gas. So in a way, environmentalists were in part to blame for the climate crisis that we see now because of the unintended consequence of trying to save the environment and resisting that form of renewable energy. So in response to electricity prices, people started turning to solar and wind power like this guy on the roof. And they decided that they could use this for small scale production. Sure, it wasn't as efficient as a large scale dam project, but the average Joe could afford it if they wanted their own energy locally on their house or farm. So then we got into the 1980s when we found out that climate change was becoming a real threat. But of course, the US decided that it was actually a hoax and there was more focus, even greater emphasis on oil. And suddenly governments didn't want to touch renewable energy generation because now that was political. So even though electric power generation increased over the past 30 years, it's still dominated by coal and gas. And if you wanted to make renewable energy, you had to do it yourself like this guy on the roof. So over the next 40 years, of course, the technology got scaled up until we reached grid scale. However, solar and wind were only ever meant as a stopgap technology because no one wanted to build large energy projects anymore. So the problem was that now we have an intermittency problem. We've created this solar and wind amount of energy, which is great, is good. Continue to build solar and wind. But it wasn't meant to completely replace coal and oil and gas because we have this intermittency problem. And you're all familiar with the intermittency problem. No matter how much solar and wind we build, it's still not going to solve for climate change by getting rid of coal and oil and gas. And that is because, and I hate it when I used to hate it when people said this. They'd say that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and that always made me mad. But unfortunately, that is the reality of it. So that when those are not happening, which is usually for a period in the evening and nighttime, we do rely on fossil fuels to get us through that period. And one of the major users of that period of electricity is industrial use, which happens 24 hours. Think of the steel mills or the large manufacturing centers all running at night, 24 hours a day. And the solar and wind is just not quite solving that problem. So we need to solve this intermittency problem. And fortunately, we have ways to do that. But the reason we have this problem is because coal is essentially a battery. Coal can store energy, solar energy, for 300 million years, and so does oil and gas. And this is a major blind spot for the industry. Solar and wind cannot store energy at all. They can only produce it. So when we say solar is cheaper than coal, we're actually only half right. With coal, oil, and gas, energy storage is in the object itself. With solar and wind, we need a whole other component. We need a battery. So that battery can be a reservoir for pumped hydro or hydroelectric. It can be stored hydrogen. It can be lithium or molten salt or hot rocks. There are multiple ways to store energy. But that's not the point. The point is we need to reframe our energy investments to compete against coal and oil in order to stop climate change. There is enormous potential to invest in technologies just beyond wind and solar. By all means, keep building it, but it's time to wake up to the demand curve that's coming. And if we have any hope of replacing oil, coal, and gas, if we have any hope of electrifying industry, if we have any hope of meeting this demand, we need to make our renewable electricity storable and not intermittent. And that basically means cogeneration. When you're building a solar or wind farm, you're also building a way to store that energy. They go hand in hand. And here's several examples. Diversification. Just like your financial portfolio, you'd want to diversify. We need to diversify our renewable energy production. We need to focus on technologies that are not intermittent, technologies that last forever, like tidal and wave energy. Here are a few current good examples. Up here on the left is a Willow Penguin. It's a wave energy generator. It just sits on the ocean like a boat at anchor. It doesn't have any height, so you don't have that NIMBY problem with offshore wind farms. No one can really see it. It doesn't have any effect on the marine environment because it has no moving parts. All it does is bob around on the surface, but that's enough to create 1 megawatt of energy. Blue X, made by Motion, is also a wave energy generator that essentially does the same thing. These are fantastically mature technologies that are ready to be installed right now. Pumped hydro, of course, has been around for 100 years. It works fantastically. Yes, it's much more expensive than other forms of battery storage, but it creates energy 24 hours a day, and it also lasts 50 to 100 years after you build it, so it's definitely worth it. And nowadays, there are thousands of locations around the world that are viable options for pumped hydro, and also you can build small-scale ones for a bit less than you used to. If you like wind power, there's a similar technology for underwater tidal energy generation. And of course, we see on land tidal energy generators like this one on the right. And geothermal. Here in New Zealand, we have 2 geothermal plants. The second one we're just finishing now, and we have a third one on the way. So it's going to provide a big part of our energy mix. And this is an option for most countries in the world. There's geothermal everywhere. And why? Because thanks to the moon and the tide never stops. Right? 100% on all the time. And like geothermal is thanks to the heat of the earth, 100% on all the time. If we ever run out of the tide or we run out of geothermal energy, we're going to have a lot bigger problems. So as investors, developers, governments, whatever your capacity, we need to broaden our horizons and our risk appetite to include additional technologies. And these are not new technologies. They've been around for a century. We just need to start funding them. I love this picture. Remember how I said there are 2 billion people coming? Well, the investment opportunities are going to be there for us. If you've spent any time on Chinese social media like WeChat or Little Red Book, you'll see ads for electric motorcycle sales in Africa. Electric motorcycles are an indicator of technological advancement in developing nations. People will be driving electric motorcycles en masse before they start driving electric cars. But first, they need reliable electric power. And that's where you come in. If you've been following China at all for the last 15 years, they've been investing heavily in African nations because of their lithium and rare earth production. And one of these things these nations need most, according to a recent article in the New Yorker, are refrigeration systems. because refrigeration is something that we take for granted, but is incredibly rare in Africa, and it requires a great deal of electricity. And as we mentioned, electric cooktops are also replacing wood for home cooking and in restaurant cooking. So Africa has tremendous opportunities. As you recall back on the population section, 9 out of the 10 fastest growing populations in the world are located in Africa. And this motorbike center you see here where it says electrifying Africa, one vehicle at a time, this is in Kenya. But you can say almost this exact same picture in nearly every country in Africa. So there's tremendous growth opportunities based on clean, renewable power going into these industries right now. I want to take a moment to talk about the US leadership exit, and talking about China's work in Africa is a perfect segue into that. 15 years ago, China saw opportunity in wind and solar, and they started to do it, and they started to take advantage of that, whereas the US did not. China is now the world's largest producer of both wind and solar. They're the largest maker of electric automobiles. They have the electric battery market locked down. They own most of the world's lithium and rare earth materials. And what they don't own, they are the world's largest processor of. Like most of us in this field, China saw this opportunity a long time ago, but the US did not. Instead, they spent all their money on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and pushed for more oil. Now the US has left the Paris Accords again, and it has indicated a renewed interest in drilling for gas and oil. The US has deprioritized climate change and decarbonization, and I'd say the US is largely responsible for having politicized it in the first place. Its automobile industry will never catch up with China now, so they're back to making petrol vehicles again. They're unlikely to continue to subsidize renewable energy development, and they're pushing back against the development of even new technologies like cellular agriculture, which we discussed before. So everywhere that renewable energy can play a role, the US is pushing back. If you're an investor or a developer, I would recommend looking for ways to decouple from the US. They're no longer the global energy leader. Now, I know they're the largest economy and they're quite rich, and if you can get that money or a piece of that market, great. But part of reframing the energy development market is realizing that we have new players taking the lead, principally China and to some extent Europe. So it's important to shift your focus of opportunity. If you have one takeaway from this presentation, it's this: demand is not the problem. The demand side is waiting for your supply. The reason we want to reframe this discussion is just to show you there's nearly unlimited demand waiting to be taken in the next 5, 10, and 100 years. I spoke to a greenhouse grower who wanted to decarbonize, but they had to choose between a gas boiler and electric heat pump. And because of the high prices of electricity, because of the undersupply of renewables, he was leaning towards a gas boiler. And I know we want to keep electricity prices high to keep investors happy, to increase annual returns, and to help fund the next project. But we have to realize that low electricity prices are driving demand. So the more we can supply cheap energy, the more demand there is to see. That guy's going to buy a gas boiler, and that demand disappears from us for the next 20 years until he's ready to make this decision again. We need to capture these buyers now so that they're relying on cheap renewable energy. What I'm saying is if we follow the Amazon model of growth so that renewable electricity pushes out oil and coal and gas globally, maybe that reduces profits a little bit over the first decade or so. But what it means is it pushes out oil and gas completely from the energy sector so that we are dominating and we have an undeniable monopoly on electricity globally. These types of decisions are taking place in businesses all over the world, big and small. And I think small is a factor here because we used to see it in big corporations, but now we're seeing it in even the smallest groups. And yes, in the short term, you worry that oversupply makes electricity too cheap to attract investors, but there are billions of users for that electricity, and we're adding 2 billion more, and those will be loyal customers for the next century. This is the next industrial revolution. That means investing in projects that solve for intermittency by bringing 24-hour power. It means over-generating power so it can be stored. It means integrating solutions such as on-site electrolyzers to create ammonia, hydrogen, and methanol so that your electricity isn't just producing electricity, it's also producing products that can be used in other industries and used as storage or a battery. It means understanding that looking at today's demand doesn't show you the demand created by decarbonization. It doesn't show you Jevons paradox. It doesn't show you Maravach's paradox. They're just waiting to kick in when your project goes online. That demand is there. It means seeing climate change as a demand driver that increases every year. So climate change is essentially pushing the market towards you. It means seeking out high growth markets in places you might never think to look. Countries in Africa, for example, where China is making big bets, or India, which is very interested in growth, or small European nations in Eastern Europe whose oil and gas energy streams have been cut off and have no alternative but electrification. Countries like Estonia, who have great infrastructure and networks of the internet and infrastructure, but they need electrical power, specifically renewable power, to do that. It means understanding that lower energy prices mean higher industry growth, which means long-term profits. And it means decoupling political leadership from electricity industry leadership. New leaders are emerging, so link your fate to theirs. It also means recognizing that we are far, far behind in electricity generation. When you see the demand curve waiting on you, and I hope this presentation has shown that to you, now you know you need to take action because we are far, far behind. If you're an investor, a developer, an industry professional, it's not a question of if, but when. Whatever your role is, increase it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Very, very interesting and valuable content that you shared with us. Really appreciate it. We have quite a bit of, still some time left for Q&A, and that's good. So, guys, if you have questions, please also post it in the Q&A button. There is a little section, not a chat, but Q&A, where you can type your questions, and we'll go through them. So we have a few questions already. So let's get started. Was the first one. So how do you conclude all of this population and demand growth when we also hear numerous studies projecting demand and population contraction, drought, food and water security collapse, etc.? Can't have it both ways.
I think it's actually the opposite. All of those things are driving demand because remember, oil, coal, and gas are still such a large part of the energy market. And the worse those things get, the more people are going to want to move away because those are the drivers of all of these climate change issues. So the more we see those issues become dire, the more people will want to decarbonize and move towards renewable electricity production. So it's actually almost a giant, every storm that comes through, every problem with supply chains, every issue that we have is really just a giant billboard that says, hey, we need more renewable electricity. And as far as the reduction in population, that's true. We are seeing that in the developed nations. Most of them are having fewer and fewer children, and it's becoming a problem. But what is happening is that we're taking a lot of what used to be offline activity, things people were doing in public with socializing, say, and now we're moving all of that online, which means all the people that are in those populations are going to require energy and electricity to do what they want to do on a daily basis, especially socializing. So I think even the population reductions in popular countries is also driving that growth for us.
Yeah, makes sense. I totally agree. So since you're, based in New Zealand, that's where your expertise, I also know that you also, quite knowledgeable about other, countries and US, but how does New Zealand cover the energy storage issue?
So New Zealand is fortunate because remember when I said about the US building the hydroelectric power, we saw in New Zealand, over half of our power comes from hydroelectric because we had a huge building phase that wasn't interrupted by the environmental movement in the way it was in the US. So we're also fortunate in that way because that hydroelectric power also serves as a battery for us. So we're close to something like 97% renewable energy right now in this country. And we have lots of solar farms, lots of wind, lots of geothermal, lots of hydroelectric. And The only thing we don't have is we still have that intermittency problem that's serving mostly here in Auckland, where we have the Huntley Power Station, and they've been using coal to solve that issue. Well, Huntley just recently moved to biomass burning as a alternative to coal, but of course that's just as bad as coal when it comes to carbon emissions, so that's also not a solution. But we also are getting around this battery issue. So we don't need to build a pumped hydro station. We don't need to build large lithium banks to support our power because we have almost an oversupply at this point. Our hydroelectric dams actually serve essentially as pumped hydro. They can sit dormant and collect water and wait until we actually need that energy, and then we can release it. In fact, our hydroelectric dams are refilled at 5 times our use rate every year, thanks to the amount of rain that we get. So we rarely run out of water, except for in the dry season. And then we have an electricity spike in prices. But as we increase our demand, as we increase our solar and wind generation in this country, even that's going to be less of a problem. So it's not necessarily a model that the rest of the country that other countries can mimic unless they want to build lots of hydroelectric dams. But if they do want to build pumped hydro, for example, that also solves both of those problems. So it's a good way to do it. One thing I didn't cover quite as well was in the presentation is that overgeneration of electricity allows you to do other things. For example, we see the increase of hydrogen use in automobiles, and we see the increase of methanol used in steel and cement production. If we're overproducing and we're attaching electrolyzers to our wind and solar farms, we can also produce that form of energy, methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen, right there on site. And so this is a great way to diversify the investment that companies are making. You're not just building solar, not just building hydro, and you're not just building wind. You're also incorporating methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen into that investment. So it's a great way to hedge your bets.
Makes sense. Perfect. Thank you for such a comprehensive answer. So for building in advance of demand to create demand, how can the projects be financed? Offtake commitments are required for financing. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem.
It is a chicken and egg problem. I know that's something that every company is facing right now. And I guess the good news is that power purchase agreements are going to be a bigger thing, but of course you need to find a large buyer for that. So it is definitely a problem. I think the reason that I wanted to show the amount of demand that's coming is to kind of help developers be able to approach their investors and reevaluate where that demand is coming from. It's not necessarily going to come from one large company that's going to be buying all of your power. It's going to come from a diverse amount of places. But I think at this point, it's inevitable. This is the wave that's coming. It's not something 20 years ago when investors were looking at renewable projects. That's why they needed you to have a purchase agreement in place, because they didn't have faith in renewable energy as a product. But now we're in a completely different environment. And this is something that has to happen. We knew it had to happen for a long time, but now it actually is happening. And I think that's the way we need to approach investors.
Okay, makes sense. How realistic is decoupling from the United States? We have seen a retreat from sustainable finance frameworks. Global companies, even in Europe, tend to still follow US policy leads. But 2017 was the big exception. But otherwise, US been kind of somewhat giving a pace to the renewable energy, and so, we have seen some large companies also ahead of recent administration changes in the US also withdraw from New Zealand. Was it Total, right, or someone else?
We had BlackRock here.
BlackRock, sorry.
They had that $2 billion investment in it, and they moved out. And I think that's the key. That's what we're seeing, is that the US it's not so much that the rest of the world is going to try to decouple from the US. It's that the US is currently decoupling itself, and it is deliberately pulling back on investments in renewable energy, is deliberately moving away from climate change action, and that's going to essentially alienate itself from what the rest of the world is doing because the rest of the world is very interested in those. Resiliency is perhaps the biggest one, and I didn't cover that. Each of the nations are now realizing that their energy infrastructure is a liability and that they need to become more energy independent as an individual nation in order to remain resilient, especially in the face of climate change and supply chain issues. And so countries will increase their interest in renewable energy for resiliency reasons, even as the US is pulling back. And I think those two factors are going to work together so that decoupling happens inevitably.
Yeah, makes sense. But for those countries that have plenty of coal and fossil fuels, oil and gas, when they see US, not spending money on renewable energy, they would, also perhaps feel a bit reluctant and say, why we have to worry about climate change and saving the planet if the world leader doesn't.
That's true. That's true. I think the difference is that they can only supply a little bit of what they need, and even if it's coal, they might have coal, they might have gas, but the world is such a globalized economy at this point that what you rely on isn't just what you can produce in your own country. For example, Australia has a lot of coal, but it's been exporting it to China for years. And now that China is interested in decarbonization, they're constantly and they've reached the maximum they can for their infrastructure development. They're reducing the amount of the coal that they buy from Australia. Australia, in the meantime, has built up its renewable energy resources, and as a result, the coal industry is collapsing in Australia. It doesn't matter that they have it; they're not going to be using it because they don't need to. They have renewable energy. And I think that's probably a good model for the rest of these countries to follow.
Well, that makes totally perfect sense. What are your thoughts on UK battery opportunities as there is more demand now for storage? Given the UK has the largest wind farm in the world, we are unable to intake all the power.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's why storage becomes such a big issue. Um, Luckily, we have so many mature technologies right now available for energy storage. Um, but I think we're still relying too much on lithium. I think there's so many opportunities, especially in pumped hydro. But the dilemma that we see a lot is that it hasn't really changed since the 70s. The reason we have solar and wind energy development is because governments just haven't been interested, or the public hasn't been interested in developing large scale energy projects anymore. Here in New Zealand, we wanted to build a pumped hydro station, but it costs so much that the public just said no because they don't understand why it's important. So I think the trouble is that we are going to rely on lithium based storage, energy storage for the next 5 years or so, just because familiarity with other systems is low, and because we still don't have an appetite for large scale government funding. But that's something that's going to evolve over time.
But you probably did some calculations in the past in terms of per megawatt hour. Lithium batteries probably storing energy using the battery is much more expensive than using pumped
It's
hydro.
much more expensive. Yeah. I don't remember what the numbers were exactly, but New Zealand Steel, now they're putting in their arc furnace and they need that 30 megawatt of power. They wanted to get over the intermittency problem by purchasing lithium batteries to store that energy for the overnight periods. And they're actually purchasing it because it's readily available. But the efficiency of them is nowhere near what you can get from, say, pumped hydro, and the cost of it is really large. The reason it's succeeding is because, and this is true throughout the energy sector and anything renewable, is because the smaller the scale, the more viable it is at the moment. So lithium is something you can put in just one battery in your home or a large set of battery banks next to your industry and factory. You can do that individually for yourself and fund it yourself, but it's not efficient. But we could, if we are all doing it, then we'd get this distributed energy storage, and supposedly that's a good thing. But I think that's probably one of the drawbacks of the industry as a whole, is that we're functioning on in individual level right now, where we'll get the energy electrification and energy generation for ourselves. We'll get the energy storage for ourselves, whatever our company is, or our state, or whatever small entity we have. We're not thinking large scale anymore. And those days might be gone. I don't know, but it's something that would be more helpful if we could get there.
With the growth of AI in the US, do you see a significant growth in the SMR and battery storage market as a supplier of electricity?
Not from the US. China has the battery market locked down. I mean, not they own something like 97% of the world's rare earth materials and the lithium and the production of those and the processing. They own the IP around it. Most companies in the world, car companies, can't even get batteries for their cars without buying them direct from China. It's just they've dominated that industry. So there may be some small tech coming out of smaller out of countries, sure, but it's never going to compete with China at this point. They're just so far ahead.
What role in future you see in graphene technologies helping curb the storage issue?
Oh, graphene is fantastic. I think that's something that needs to mature. I've seen a lot of interesting ways we can use it. It's also the way we can produce it is fantastic. So yeah, graphene is a big one. Uh, I'd like to see more of that being developed.
Mhm. Great. Um, so what industries are seeing the biggest shifts towards electrification?
Well, that's a beautiful thing. It's literally all industries right now. I mean, we think of some industries like air transportation, for example, being hard to decarbonize, and that phrase is going out of fashion because it doesn't matter how hard it is, all of them are trying to do it. And while some of them might be lagging and some of them may take 15, 20 years to make it actually happen, the process has already started. They're working on it right now, and that technology is either being invented or implemented. So, yeah, decarbonization is happening across all industries. And I think that's what's so exciting about this and why we're seeing this huge demand curve is that we're still the way we think about the demand is maybe 10 or 15 years behind where we actually are at. And we didn't see the demand surge coming out of the COVID crisis. So even in the last 2 years, we're seeing all these companies interested in decarbonization. And I think I would encourage people to go out there and talk to each of those industries. Maybe go to completely unrelated industry conferences and understand what they're talking about. Because I've had the opportunity to do that. I've gone to many different industries, and whereas 5 years ago you might not hear anything about climate change or decarbonization, now the keynote speaker is talking about it, and at least a third of the talks in that conference will be about climate change and decarbonization. It's really a remarkable change in just the last few years.
Well, we have time for a few more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
so, I know that New Zealand is very, advanced in terms of the geothermal technologies, and the question that came through is, I think about specific technologies in geothermal sector. So, what do you think of disruptions in geothermal technologies, mostly EGS and AGS systems?
So we're seeing some really interesting work coming out. I know even the U.S. I know I said that they're moving away from it, but individual companies are still working on it. And yeah, geothermal is great because even individual houses can access the heat of the earth in order to heat their homes and remove that power. So I think it's something we're going to see more of. I think cities, if as they grow and expand and build new portions of the cities, are going to be using geothermal locally. I think it's going to get cheaper to drill those wells and tap into it. It's just there's a tremendous amount of growth there.
And one more question is okay. So, what impact does again about the U.S. What impact does the U.S. leadership exit have on global energy markets? We have partially covered it, but perhaps if you want to wrap it up, was the final comments about the U.S. involvement in the whole renewable energy, situation.
Well, unfortunately, the price of energy is still largely driven by oil prices, and I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of volatility over the next 2 years as a result of U.S. moves between the instability that it's causing in the Middle East, especially, and with the amount of promises they're making for their drilling. But on the other hand, there is something interesting. I guess I could draw a parallel to in New Zealand. We have a government called the National Party, and they're very similar to Republicans in the way they think. And they came into office promising to increase drilling for oil and gas in New Zealand. Um, and the gas companies told them, yeah, we're just not interested. It's not financially viable to us anymore. So I think when we talk about this topic, we really need to separate the political rhetoric, which is coming out, from the reality. And I think what we're going to see is that a lot of these companies, even big oil companies, are going to be saying, oh, that's nice that you gave us this permit to drill somewhere. Trump is asking us to go drill in the Arctic or something. But yeah, that turns out to be very expensive and probably not going to work for our bottom line. So thanks anyway, because that's what we saw here in New Zealand. And so I think that's something to watch a little more carefully.
Well, great. Yeah, I'll be in San Diego in the US next week, so it would be interesting to feel what are the, what are the kind of thoughts going on around everything that, the changes that are coming. So if any of you guys who are with us here today planning to attend Intersolar next week in San Diego, I'll be happy to meet you in person. As I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, we will also be having a booth in Rimini in Italy, the first week of March, and then later in May in Intersolar in Munich. So happy to meet you guys in person, whoever can make it to one of those conferences. Great content, great webinar and presentation. Thank you, Seth. Really enjoyed it. A lot of good questions. Thank you for everyone for sticking around. While we're wrapping up, you still have a chance to download Seth's presentation from the chat section. There are a number of useful links for you there as well, where you can learn about what we do, about how to submit your projects for review, projects that need funding, about our referral program, where you can send projects, refer projects to us, and we would reward you for this, of course. So thanks once again, Seth, for taking time so early. It's now it's already 6 a.m., so you can have your your coffee and breakfast. But yeah, I really appreciate you for accommodating multiple time zones that our audience are located in. So we have quite a large network and always work around the clock.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you for having me.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
thank you to everyone who was on the call, and thanks for all the great questions. I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you, Seth. For those who joined late or or was here only for part of the presentation, we will be sending the recording as well. And we'll probably attach, I'll ask Amira to attach your presentation as well, if you don't mind.
Great, perfect.
Thank you. Okay, guys, have a great morning for those who are in the US and in New Zealand, and evening for us in Dubai and Europe, I suppose. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
Bye. Yes.